Hello, welcome to NC Exclusive. I'm Felicity Izewike. Our guest is the Executive Director for the Coalition for Dialogue on Africa, CoDA, an independent and international but African-owned forum which identifies and discusses issues of importance to Africa's development within a global context. This accomplished leader with over 2 decades of experience in senior roles in international organizations also brings a wealth of expertise to her role as the head of the Secretariat of the African Union High-Level Panel on Illicit Financial Flows, IFFs, from Africa, where she coordinates the consortium to stem IFFs from Africa. Souad Aden-Osman, thank you for sparing the time to talk to us.
Thank you, my sister.
All right, let's start with a basic for our viewers. Tell us about CoDA and, of course, the connection with IFFs.
Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be here again in Lagos. My boss lives not far from here, so we dash quickly to get papers signed.
Yes. How was your visit, though? I know you...
In Abiyakuta, it was fantastic, as usual. Okay. We relax, we recharge. We move 1 or 2 lines and go back to work. Okay. Yeah, we usually come to Baba when we get stuck. Okay. So he unblocks the situations for us. So when you were reading my bio, the accomplished leader part of it, when you work with some of them, we're still serving.
You learn from those
Absolutely,
people.
we are civil servants. I've been a civil servant all my life, and from national civil servant to international civil servant. So the leadership is, we leave it to those who can really lead us, hopefully, collectively at once. CoDA, the Coalition for Dialogue on Africa, is a special initiative of the African Union, African Development Bank, Afrexim Bank, and the Economic Commission for Africa of the United Nations. It was set up, established in 2009 to serve as a platform for candid, honest, conversations to define what African narrative should be about, particularly in the context of the institutions at continental level. The continent, and so the 4 I just talked about, well, the UNECA is now taking a bit of a step back. As a UN organization, it's being pushed around. But the other 3 are very African institutions, and of course, all of them are supposed to work under the auspices of the African Union. We have our offices within the AU. Our work is actually to identify areas that are difficult for the institutions to deal with in terms of narrative, in terms of having frank conversations, and to organize how the non-state actors come into intergovernmental conversations, because these are very structured, very restricted conversations that happen among governments. They make decisions that have impact on our lives. Therefore, the main other actors, academia, media, and of course, and the most important one, civil society, views must be brought into these conversations in a very structured
help
manner.
To untangle areas that might seem tricky to...
Absolutely. The continent has 55 member states, at least the 55 that the African Union recognizes. And they are at different stages, different size of economies, weight in terms of even people. So we do have conversations. We are, and we will have difficult conversations on a number of topics. So an independent platform that is yet their own without it's independent enough to intellectually say there is an issue here, and this is maybe how you should go about it, is crucial.
Okay.
And
I'm tempted to ask, do you actually get attention for having this crucial dialogue? But before that, just make the connection for IFFs. How are you connected?
So CoDA is a legal entity and therefore has its governance structure. It's led by a board that has always had a former heads of state, African heads of state, as a chair. Our current chair is former President Olusegun Obasanjo. And it has a number of members that are carefully chosen depending on the period we are and what we wanted to pick as topics. We had, and the board decides what we work on. In 2018, there was a decision to host the secretariat of an orphan. The AU is a big machine that generates a lot of things, ideas, institutions, instruments, platform of all sorts over time. And some of them grow, some of them shrink, some of them are fought, some of them, and they need protection. And so CoDA needed the protection of Africans of the caliber of President Obasanjo at some point. And the illicit financial flows was dealt with since 2010 by another group that was also led by a former President Thabo Mbeki of South Africa. And they had finished their work, and the way intergovernmental organizations work, whether to an individual or a group, the heads of states give a mandate, or at least their ministers on behalf of the heads of states and governments. And when they finish their work, the institutions shy away from difficult conversations. So it was okay up to a certain point, but beyond a certain point, now it's a function of reputation for fundraising and a host of other considerations that are unfortunately considerations that we shouldn't be taking into account when we're talking about serious topics. And that's where CoDA comes in. That's where CoDA picked illicit financial flows and asset recovery. And we hosted the secretariat of that platform that became almost an organ. I mean, everybody recognized this, but without necessarily wanting to be associated with it beyond this point. It's a very complex.
So, recognizing it and its effectiveness, is that the reason for the recognition, or it is because people are afraid of what you might do to them?
Well, it's both, because the history of this continent is what it is. So you are bound to be working in something that is no longer okay for you to fit in. So the international financial architecture, the way it is, was not set up for the interest of Africa.
Okay. Talk to us about maybe one or two controversial questions that CoDA had
illicit
taken.
financial flows beyond.
Yeah, you talk about. Okay, let's find out how that is going, stemming illicit financial flows, and then perhaps one or key activities that you've done that has resonated and gotten you some real attention.
Like every major topic that the African Union is dealing with, we must deal with it at all three levels. We call the three levels. National level is where you're supposed to be dealing with the issues. Implementation of decisions and actual actions must happen at national level, because that's where you're supposed to make the difference for your people.
Okay.
Now, at the continental level, we're forging narrative. We're coordinating ourselves. We are fostering the togetherness. We are defending the values of the unity. And from there, of course, as one continent with a unified message, we take our issues to global level, because we are still in the business of pushing back on some of these things. So one thing that CoDA did, for example, to support this high-level panel, because we have two platforms led by two former heads of states, and we serve as a secretariat for both. And that complementarity is what we were looking for, and it happened, and it's very important. Okay. So on the illicit financial flows, which is a systemic global phenomenon that is really basically perpetuating the extraction that justified the decolonization, the pushback came in the way that was resonating with our side and said, you have illicit financial flows because you're corrupt. And said, no, wait, we may have corruption, but we're not more corrupt than others, and the proceeds of corruption end somewhere. So as far as we're concerned, it's about the return, the recovery and the return of what leaves our shores. And so we formulated the Common African Position on Asset Recovery and Return in 2020. That could be seen as one of the ways CoDA came to the front was recognized.
But you mentioned something that at the national level, yes, you have to also work at that. But how can you, considering the fact that each nation has its unique challenges, what is the connecting factors for 54 countries, you say?
55.
55 countries, you say.
According to the AU, it's 55.
How do you do that in such a way that, you could have a cohesive policy that works to help address these illicit flows?
Well, we are organized. We've been organizing. So the way AU functions, the way the regional economic communities, whether the subsidiarity is actually completely functioning or not is immaterial, but there is a lot of effort towards that. And so the recognition of that dynamic is actually what it is about, and being able to navigate those waters and be able to bring conversations at global level down to the national level, and then make sure that the idea is to recognize, all of us recognize ourselves as being Africans, and we defend what African means. And so we are in the most populous country of the continent that has always defended, particularly at global level, because Nigeria can push its way around. And that is one of the ways we work at national level, is to recognize that some of our countries are more advanced on some of these topics, and therefore they champion one topic or the other. That is actually the most important thing to recognize, that they bring, every country can bring something, and when one of them falls, the others are actually pulling and helping. So that solidarity that we should continue to foster is actually the name of the game, and I think African nations in general recognize themselves in that context.
There's this, sometimes I talk to leaders, and some of the things that they talk about is the concern about partnerships and collaboration in Africa. But from what you were saying, there is a clear indication that you cannot do your work if there are no clear partnership, collaborations, and a dialogue. Who are some of these key partners that help with, stemming illicit financial flows?
At this stage, we actually, as far as CoDA is concerned, we like to count on our own institutions and on our own funding to the extent possible. And if we have to turn to others, at least in as far as the means of implementation of our own decisions, for which we have evidence, which we research, we are very adamant about not remaining target or subject of research of others. We wanted to be the ones researching what it is about, so that we can authoritatively speak to these matters. Now, one of the main partners is actually, it's the platform, it's the United Nations, not necessarily as a partner, but as a platform where we are there on an equal foot with everybody. And therefore, if we want to stage anything, if we wanted to contest anything beyond internationally. Of course, we have our own African Union to handle our issues, but when we wanted to bring it to the attention of others, the only partner we would call and platform as the United Nations, and therefore we do take that the work within that context seriously. And there, Africans are very organized. We start with the African group of ambassadors. There, they're no longer 55, they're 54, because there's one that is not recognized by the UN. But then we immediately fall into the bigger group of the G77. And therefore, and we are the majority there, so we immediately. And now when you have G77 plus China, then you have most of the weight you need to do what you need to do. And usually by the time we reach that point, it's a global South issue. And therefore, we're looking at the global North.
More in the background, per se. You do your work by getting people that need to make the decisions to have conversations that push. But I want you to talk about asset recovery policy. Did I get that right? I couldn't write, so
common African position on asset recovery and return.
Yeah. So talk to us about how effective that has been so far, and perhaps if there is consideration for improvement or adjustment, or I don't know, how comprehensive is it?
Well, the thinking and the putting it down, we have done that work well. As we usually do. On paper, everything is perfect.
But implementation is always where we fail.
And so whether it's being used as we hoped it would be, and if not, why, is actually something we're assessing. It has been 10 years since the Special Declaration on Illicit Financial Flows was passed by the heads of states and governments. And it has been actually 5 years. Next year, and we're talking 2025, will be 5 years since the Common African Position on Asset Recovery was passed. And a number of issues we have been grappling with were properly formulated, and the fact that it has been endorsed by heads of state, it's a matter of implementation. We're going to push. Some of these topics that we are busy with are actually the most complicated. If they were easy, probably CoDA wouldn't be the one dealing with it. CoDA deals with complicated issues, not necessarily in terms of difficult conversations, but even to walk the outcome of those talks. And therefore, as a nimble and responsive institution, which we became eventually, we exist as an AU instrument precisely because we need all these endorsements immediately. And actually brings me to the question you asked earlier, are we listened to? We don't allow anybody to ignore us.
Okay.
It doesn't matter who, whether it's
how do you ensure they listen?
They will feel it. They will see us. We keep at them. We keep at the pressure. We do. We keep the pressure. We keep issues on the table. We keep researching it. We keep talking about it. We keep making sure that whoever could do something is supported, protected, and we nurture that kind of reactive and responsiveness to things that we don't want to see anymore.
So will it be fair now to say that maybe the push rubbishes talks about CoDA being just a mere think tank that has no teeth to bite?
Well, I don't know. We don't want to bite anybody. We want them to listen. Okay. And it's about international cooperation. The sad thing is that those we are supposed to converse with and talk to do not mean cooperation. So you can't think that something we already discussed, researched enough, put out there that you claim to be a priority remains a priority for all sorts of reasons, and we can't. These things have real impact on real people, particularly on our part. If we are part of a conversation, it means something to our people, and therefore continuously discussing these matters. So we bite, yes, there are so many ways in which you can bite, and I think making sure that real action by those who have a yay or nay say happens, we try to get to that.
Okay, this is not just an African contained situation. You have to get international partners, diaspora community. I'm interested in what you're doing with diaspora communities and how they're involved in helping, stem IFS.
At this stage, our work is really limited to what governments are supposed to do and bring it to the attention of policymakers. They have a real impact on how we go about life, whether on the continent or abroad. So our main focus are actually African Union member states, okay, and what they are supposed to do. The whole notion of a capable state is what is at stake for CoDA. So it's about making sure that the policymakers understand what it is about, know how to go about it. We help anyone who's showing interest in supporting them immediately, deploying ourselves, structuring task forces, formulating what they are supposed to be looking at, making it ready to use for them. So it is mainly that. When it comes to the remaining, whether on the actors on the continent or abroad, it's about listening, carefully listening and taking what they have to say on board. Whether we are able to do something about it at this stage, I don't think so.
Yeah, I mean, there's so much to ask you, and I've just been listening and getting questions from what you're saying. But I do have some scripted questions I think is important, and that's how you're helping with the Africa Free Trade area. Well, let's go for a quick breather. And when we come back, we'll be taking that on and other issues that has to do with CoDA and, of course, IFS. Do stay with us.
Africa needs its own storytellers, people who understand the continent because they're from it. People who know that news is more than just a conversation starter, it's our stories. Because these stories run deeper than headlines and segments. It's about digging deeper to get the facts and telling the human side of every single story, not just the echoes from foreign headlines and perspectives. It's time to take back our narratives and share them in our voices. The birth of Africa's New Age reporting, and this is where it begins, right here at News Central TV, the stories that put Africa first.
Thank you for staying with us. We're still talking with the Executive Director for the Coalition for Dialogue in Africa, CoDA, and we've been speaking on a couple of issues. Just before the break, I mentioned we'll be looking at the African Continental Free Trade Area. CoDA facilitates cooperation among stakeholders towards the successful implementation of the AFCF at the moment. So I'd like you to speak on that. What work has been done by CoDA so far in that?
Yeah. No, when the decision on the AFCFTA was made in Kigali, all of us, those of us who follow how policy making on the continent happens, were really impressed. It was one of those rare moments where the continent moved as one on a topic, and it was unprecedented number of signatories to the agreement and then ratification in record time. And of all the major decisions that have been made since the Abuja Treaty that established the Regional Economic Community, I think this decision was one that was going and will have an impact on the lives and livelihoods of Africans, and therefore it triggered a number of things. I mean, an institution like the Afreximbank came to the fore, and we're really happy that that happened, if for anything, to have brought Afreximbank into the picture. As far as we're concerned, at the beginning, we usually complement and further what the AU is doing. So we stay away from what is being done by others. We're very, very careful not to step on the toes of anyone, because there is enough topics that no one is dealing with for us to deal with. But we realized that there were two groups that were important, that were not feeling right about this. The first one are the two vulnerable groups of the continent, the youth and the women. Precisely because of the way our economists see things. Now that we are really working with heterodox economists, it was all about big business. It is changing, at least in terms of narrative, but it was all about big business. And therefore, the so-called informal sector, which is where the people are, where the energy of most of our underdeveloped economies are, seem to be overlooked. And so we've been helping the African Union Commission organizing what we call the civil society forums on the AFCFTA. Then we were brought into a more complicated conversation where the private sector was not feeling that it had an established way of working with the AFCFTA organizations or institutions, because the agreement created a number of instruments. And so we had facilitated a conversation between the AU, and that was before the Secretariat of the AFCFTA was established in Accra, and the Chambers of Commerce, because there were a number of Chamber of Commerce and industry platforms that were mushrooming, and the typical attitude of our commission is to say no. And CoDA says, no, you can't stop this. Actually, you should nurture that. Let that energy be, and see, welcome it, find a way to accommodate it. This is what it was meant to be. And so we accompanied the African Union Commission, Department of Trade and Industry, to the point where we have established the African Business Council. And recently, the African Business Council, that is getting stronger, is now pushing for a narrative that we were really waiting for a while, that our private sector sees in our natural resources in terms of value addition, what everybody else is seeing. We don't understand why basic things like polishing and cutting is not happening on the continent, labs to test these things, and that we are taking away from the continent, and so that we get a real value for our resources. So these are few ways in which CoDA has been and continues to help.
I'm curious as to what the African Business Council has been able to do or is doing. Could you talk to us a bit about that?
Yes, we always do something until a baby is born, and then if they need us, we go back into it. That responsiveness we really entertain, and we go out of our way to make sure that we spot where there is a problem and try to fill that gap. But they have been very good at keeping up with positioning African private sector endeavors, I would say, or interventions or participation in a number of ways. Recently, we have launched, they invited us to accompany them together with other institutions of the continent, other think tanks and dialogues and debates platforms to have a more in-depth conversation that are actually happening, have been happening for the past 30 years in Cape Town, in the mining in Daba, which is more exclusive way of the foreign private sector conversing with our ministers of trade and industry. They wanted to bring it a bit closer, but we did not involve yet the governments. We are talking among ourselves so as to put something on the table and say these things must be. So they are paying attention to a number of things, particularly value addition on our natural resources. They have been at the table of most of those forums that business people value. I'm not a business person so far, but they have been keeping up with all the major trade platforms where the policy needs to be looked at carefully. I'm not sure they are part of the conversations in the context of the WTO or not. They are really the private sector side of it. So I don't know to what the extent to which, by working with the Commission, they rally those views and make sure that the Commission picks them up and takes them to the ministers of trade. But they are very much entertaining and more African-owned.
I mean, this is a good conversation because prior to us talking, I've not heard of CoDA, and I did mention to you before we came on that I've not heard of CoDA, and I'm sure a lot of people haven't, but this conversation so far has broken it down, and we kind of have a picture of what you do, and you're working in the background basically for the benefit of all Africans. The ECO was proposed for ECOWAS at some point as one sure way to ensure regional integration and the penetration of the AFCFTA. Are there still conversations about a single currency for the continent, or is that something more futuristic? Because, I mean, most of the dominant currencies, the dollar, the euro, and all of that, and then people say that this is one way, to make sure we're really maximizing the benefit of the free trade area. Well,
you say two things. ECO was for ECOWAS region, right? Okay. So continental conversation on one currency for the continent. I'm not quite sure. There is ongoing conversations that at least are serious at this stage, continent-wide. ECO came and died, like most of these conversations when we are talking about monetary policy, particularly in a region that has francophones, anglophones, where there is a monetary zone within the zone, which doesn't involve everybody, involves only 8 of them, UMOA. So the existence of the CFTA, the CFA was actually what brought also this whole conversation about the ECO, and it continues, but no longer in the context of the ECO, but more in determining how the whole region works as a region. It was the most integrated, vibrant, a number of things that we are not seeing in the remaining of the continent were already happening here, freedom of movement and so on. And it's really a pity that because we couldn't pass a certain stage in those conversations that are on the table in one part of the continent are happening. So, but one thing that at continental level happened and is important and hailed by economists was the proposal that Afreximbank put on the table, the African payment and settlement system, which basically allows African countries in the context of an EFCFTA, which is the largest trade agreement, but also economic zone, basically, by membership, right? So how do we work together quickly? If we could, they well-researched, well-organized, already used, but not really maybe picked up by everybody, which could be a way of not continuing to have wrong conversations about some of these things because of the backgrounds, because of the realities, the economies, the size of economies. So I think what Afreximbank put on the table is a way to say, let's have real serious conversations because the world is not waiting for us. You're already trading. We wanted to amplify that. We wanted to continue to foster and nurture that intra-African trade and scale it up and so on. So I'm saying there are solutions, and not necessarily in terms of single currency.
So that's not even
at continental level. No, I don't think. I'm not aware of everything, and of course, not this
it was talked so much about at some point that you were like, oh, it's something that can happen. And then I had some guests who were very optimistic that if that happens, it will be the panacea to half of our problems. But obviously that's not the case. All right, what has been the biggest challenge that CoDA has had to overcome to combat IFFs, and what opportunities do you see for growth and improvement?
On the illicit financial flows, it was to actually the fact that we picked up illicit financial flows allowed us to prove the concept. And there was thinking by a number of leaders in 2009 saying we need an instrument of this nature, and it should not be a standalone institution, but rather an initiative embedded within the institution and therefore uses their structures. And that is how we exist now, and we have proved that concept, and we pick topics that are important. With the wave of coups, we had immediately set up an area of focus for which we raised more than $2 million to facilitate private conversations. There was a period we were coming to Abeokuta very often and locking everybody with chief of army staffs and others and just say, what is going on? How do we deal with this? So I am saying truly and genuinely African instruments that can remain small, but nimble enough, responsive enough, and that can earn the right to be heard when they need to, but definitely able to authoritatively speak to topics they pick. I think that the acceptance by its own parents is one of, with the exception of Afreximbank. Afreximbank is an exception to the rule of the other 3 regional institutions, but the other ones that are old and heavy and really have an issue accepting that this child had grown and it's time to recognize a seat for it and leave it exist the way it is. So the legal status of CoDA now is still a conversation for legal officers that are bound to see things in a way that is disconnected from the reality of the policy making, of serious conversations, of forging a narrative, of defending an African, positioning an African stance at global level, of making sure that where there is a need for coordination, that happens. And then nimble enough, respectful enough to accept and say, if you wanted to do something at national level, which is to improve the implementation of the decisions of our assembly, is to accept that you need legitimacy, that you need rigor, and you should make it state-led because they have the most impact on the kind of work we wanted to do. So we are also fighting back, that is the second side, with a donor community that is refusing to accept that some of these topics are better left with those who can legitimately deal with it, because to prepare
even within the African context, you're still having challenges with allowing.
Yes.
I mean, but you seem to be fighting ahead despite all the distractions that come. But let's just move a little from CoDA and IFFs and talk about women. I know that's also an area you have interest in, women and children. Continent-wide, we have women in leadership positions, but it doesn't seem to be enough for a lot of people. There is the conversation about how women are, those that get to the peak, they tend to fall by the wayside. So what are your thoughts about women in leadership positions in Africa and what future do you see for that spectrum of our growth?
All right. So if I could help rephrase a little bit so that I can better answer the question, it's not only about the African context. It's about some of these environments. The intergovernmental institutional context, which is a very hierarchical, vertical, top-down working environment, it's male-dominated, not on the continent, everywhere.
Okay.
It's far more brutal in the United Nations, I would say, than it is in the AU, for example. African women have been fighting their way, and they may like to ignore us, but they have not succeeded
compared
so far.
to 10 years ago, for instance, we've made inroads.
I think there has always been that the weight that women carry that has been by all African subculture recognized. And therefore that is carried in our. Now, we were talking about the ills we are dealing with, for example, of recognizing your own child when they're doing well. But some of these institutions went adrift, so much so that, of course, this is another one that should be dealt with properly. And we are trying to do it in every way we can, not in terms of tokenization. It's not about opposing manuals, and you need to go beyond that. How do we choose these women? We cannot choose the weak among ourselves and then tell us we failed on that one. You can't do that. And sadly, that is what seems to be what's going on a lot. And we're not organized enough in a context that doesn't belong to anyone to bring, I would say, the solidarity, women's solidarity, when we manage to get to the top, and you will be alone, right? You don't have enough sisters to, and those who got there are actually so rough that they go for the weakest, and you chances are another woman will be seen as the weak link. And so there is a difficulty there. In all international organizations, I would say, some of them have policies that protect women and bring up that leadership.
It seems the fight is just getting warmed up. We still have a long way to go.
Absolutely.
Per se. But this pressure of expectation for those who are at this position, do you think maybe it impacts their performance to a degree? Maybe this is actually what brings them down, distracts them from the work that they're supposed to do?
I don't think anybody can bring us down if we don't play by their books. You're supposed to stick to what you are. You're supposed to you're there as a professional. It's an institutional context. There are rules, but if you decide to breach them, if you decide to play with those rules, if you decide to, well, then everything else that was wrong will also be amplified. I think that some of us have used a different approach to this whole thing. I recognize how African societies work, but there are boundaries beyond which we shouldn't allow some of these things to happen. But sadly, because we lack confidence, particularly in some of these environments, we tend to give in more.
Talk to us about the taking into consideration of women and children away from tokenism you mentioned. Can we have a more inclusive community for women and children? Because it seems most times most of the things we see are done for the cameras, and not like at the core of really bringing women and children to growing them in such a way that we can have leaders who are fearless.
It boils down to, that's why I kept repeating that institutions that are supposed to foster this, what we need is usually quickly expressed and formulated in terms of policy and actions and so on. What we lack is means of implementation. And with the means of implementation come the thinking. So if you cannot independently not only think, but do, then yeah, we're getting further from that side. That's why we kept saying that an institution that is not even 20 or 25% the size of another institution can have far more impact on all of us. Like now I do compare to my two parent institutions, African Development Bank and Afrexim Bank. One is neither African nor developmentalist, and the other one came into the picture through trade, and yet we are feeling its impact. So I'm saying it's about leadership, and it doesn't have to be a woman leading for a leader to be sensitive to gender issues. Youth is a different conversation now. They are the majority on the continent. They have expectations that are high because they are very talented.
Not being met, actually.
And they are yes, and they rightly so expecting a lot, and are more and more impatient, and that is a totally different conversation which should be dealt with quickly.
All right, let's just wrap up with this question. What would be your message, or what message would you like to leave with, I mean, the person that has been following us for the past hour, and perhaps African leaders and international community regarding the importance of addressing illicit financial flows?
Well, if anybody cares about this word being a better word, not only on illicit financial flows, because it's key, and it's building on where we came from and where we are now and where we will be. It's for everyone to really accept that Africa is important, that Africans can no longer tolerate some of these thinking and way of doing. Bad governance is should be out of the way. So the basics are financial integrity, accountability, and transparency, and those values must be upheld immediately. The soonest the better, because they are the fundamentals that are missing in us getting where we are, because we are set to go and we are moving, but we will get there faster.
Souad, thank you so much.
You're very welcome.
With us. I appreciate it.
Thank you very much. Thank you for having me.
And also thank you too for watching. I hope this conversation has been as beneficial for you as it is for us that had it. Until the next one, I'll say bye for now.